Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
Past Keltham was placed somewhere that he would, in fact, get to know some damned people. Kids his own age, with a much, much poorer education, who wouldn't have qualified for most Dathilani adulthood tests. How they ended up damned. They were dragged into a banquet hall and told to sell their souls to devils. After being raised to believe, whether it was truth or lie, that if they refused, they'd die and go to hell right away and have a worse time of it, on account of how they'd earlier gone along with being forced to cast acid splash on their classmates, and later on prisoners and orphans. Also, their minds were being read for signs of disloyalty, forbidding them to actually think about their situation. He's aware that past Keltham may have been placed someplace where he'd be selectively exposed to evidence of the system functioning in that way. It remains validly signifying evidence that Pharasma's system has a mode for damning people like Ione Sala, who atoned to true neutral after leaving Cheliax, and ended up natural neutral good almost immediately after. If she hadn't been oracled by Nethys, Ione would have been damned. Peranza actually did sell her soul, and did go to hell. Another reason people go to hell? Malediction. An Asmodean priest was using that spell on children too. Pharasma apparently doesn't give a shit. At best, it might be a negative weight in her utility function that she traded to the ancient gods of evil for something else that she wanted. A tradable medium-sized negative utility is not the same as her really giving a shit. People he knew personally who might actually deserve preemptive cryosuspension. Abigail, Aspexia, Maidal, and Subarax probably. Elias Abarco apparently. Possibly Avaricia, and some of the second-gen project researchers. Even of those, he did not really get to see them doing very much that was wrong. Maybe it would feel different if he'd watched Abarco rape Carissa, and then again, maybe it wouldn't. Thousands of years of torment seems like disproportionate revenge, even if you grant the concept of revenge. Possibly his personal experience is statistically unrepresentative of creation. He gets that. Though he wasn't put in position to witness the very worst, hasn't actually scried in hell some orphan who got maledicted because a priest still had that spell at the end of the day. But sure, he may have been put in position to witness statistically unrepresentative amounts of damnation due to soul sale. The thing is that Pharasma permits Peranza to go to hell after being forced to sell her soul, or that she traded away the possibility and actuality of children getting maledicted, even if she mildly dispreferred that, is strongly informative about what sort of entity Pharasma actually is. On a larger scale, he figured out sometime around INT 27 that part of why almost everyone in Cheliax goes to hell is that their fiat currency is backed by souls, causing everyone's acts of spending money to count as soul trading. He's not sure how large a part that is of Chelish universal damnation protocols. They could ask Aracura or Dispater later if safe oaths can be established there, but it's some part, given that Cheliax goes to the effort at all. Cheliax might be a statistically unrepresentative place for Keltham to have landed inside of creation, receiving a disproportionate amount of effort from Asmodeus, because Golarion is where Rovagug is contained, or because Golarion is where prophecy is shattered. But that Cheliax is a possible mode for planets in Pharasma's creation means that if Pharasma's creation is allowed to continue, maybe it all goes to Cheliax. He does not particularly think that Asmodeus has a worse chance of reshaping creation in his preference than non-ancient Iomedae has of saving it. And then, of course, there's all the feral kids in the boneyard, many of whom merely go to the Abyss or Abaddon, of course, but some of whom go to hell, including the ones who choose hell at the gates of Abaddon. Those are some of the defects from a humane standpoint in who goes to hell. There's also the point that eternal, soul-destroying torment is not a human standpoint on deserved revenge, even if somebody did terrible things in life, and even if you legitimate the entire emotion of revenge. He is aware, at this level of intelligence, that Dathilon probably has some amount of mortal Golarion-like horror in its hidden past. He genuinely does not know how much. He genuinely does not know the extent to which Dathilon's past was Golarion without magic, before Dathilon did heritage optimization to make it better, or if the people in Golarion have interbred with evil beings, or had some of their goodness and intelligence destroyed by selection pressures over millennia. But it really doesn't seem to him, when he looks inside himself, for emotions buried under culture that would have evolved in him. It doesn't seem to him, if he felt really angry at somebody, angry enough to want to hurt them, even if nothing good would come of that he'd want to hurt them forever and ever, until they turned into paving stones, forgot their names and the hurt they'd dealt to him, and then go on hurting them. Humanoids evolving from before civilization started, before farming started, shouldn't want to levy unbounded punishments on each other for bounded misdeeds. That's not where the evolutionarily stable strategy should settle. Hell doesn't seem to him like a concept that human beings would invent for themselves from scratch if they didn't grow up in Golarion, thinking of it as part of the way things are. He's not sure. It's a guess that could be wrong in the same direction that he's been wrong before. It's not really a crux. None of this is a crux. He should warn her, before this line of thought continues for too long, because at INT 27 he lost his ability to think of evil humans in Golarion as anything but bigger boneyard children. He was trying to hold on to his sense of people in Golarion as having their own virtues and strengths, who were experienced emergency responders, even if they couldn't pass 13-year-old adulthood tests, who had their own plans and purposes, even if they were INT 10 or INT 8. He tried to keep hold of that sense. He really did. He lost his last grasp on it after he put on the artifact headband. That people in Golarion damn themselves is the final proof of their innocence, in a way. Why think that they really understand the pain they deal to others, any more than their mind can successfully span time to understand the pain they're bringing upon themselves in the future? The future isn't really real to them, and that's why they destroy it.
It doesn't really bother Carissa that the soul trade counts as evil. It does seem like probably something happened where, say that Pharasma's conception of good and evil is 99% the same as a human conception of those things. That doesn't mean that the world will end up 99% as good as if she'd gotten it right, because Asmodeus can deliberately identify the places where human values and Pharasman values aren't quite the same, and try to build a society that leverages those to make humans be Pharasman evil without being human evil. Though mostly, Cheliax just makes people normal human evil. Keltham's Ostenso wizards are younger than Carissa. They haven't yet had world wound assignments where they mind-read and report defectors, or are allowed to punish misbehavior by their own inferiors. Carissa isn't sure that being muddled means you can't be meaningfully evil, can't meaningfully deserve punishment. She agrees that you don't deserve torture for the rest of the lifetime of the universe, at least not if it's feasible to provide you with something better than that. And she agrees that they do, after all, have to end hell, if it can be done without having the whole universe gobbled up by outer gods or something worse. She doesn't feel urgency about doing it. They could build a civilizaton that will have better ideas about how to do it, and she'd be satisfied with that. But she agrees, in the end, that it has to be done.
One of his guesses about Pharasma is that, since she seems plausibly loosely inspired by some humane civilization's concepts of good and evil, somebody tried to build a medium-sized entity and failed. That scenario in distorted mortal story form could sound like Pharasma is the last survivor of a previous universe, that in fact Pharasma ate because the previous universe wasn't optimal under her alien values and she wanted to replace it. Possibly there was some previous universe in which trading of souls was almost always evil, and the people there were punished with prison sentences. Obviously, Dathilan would never set it up that way, but having seen Golarion, he can imagine some other universe working like that. Then Pharasma was built, and learned from some sort of data, or training or something, a concept of punishing evildoers, as defined by written rules, by sending them to a place they don't like. And then, uncaringly of original rationales and purposes, instantiated something sort of like that, in a system which classified soul trading as unconditionally evil across all places and times and intents, and punished that by sending people to hell, which entities like Asmodeus could then exploit to get basically innocent people into hell through acts that they didn't mean to hurt anyone and didn't understand for evil. This, as Carissa observed less formally, is simply what you'd expect to follow from the principle of systematic divergences when optimizing over proxy measures. Maybe in some original universe where soul trading wasn't a proxy measurement of evil and nobody was optimizing for things to get classified as evil or not evil, soul trading was almost uniformly actually evil as intuitively originally defined. As soon as you establish soul trading as a proxy of evil, and something like Asmodeus starts optimizing around that to make measurements come out as maximally evil, It's going to produce high evilness measurements via gotchas like soul-backed currency that are systematically overestimates of actual evilness, as intuitively originally defined. An entity at Pharasma's level could have seen that coming, at her presumable level of intelligence, when she set those systems in place. If she didn't head it off, it's because she didn't care about actual underlying evilness as intuitively originally defined. Allowing malediction also isn't particularly a symptom of caring a lot about whether only really evil in an underlying informal intuitive sense people end up in hell. Pharasma was maybe inspired by human values at some point, or picked up a distorted thing imperfectly copied off the surface outputs of some humans as her own terminal values, that she then cared about unconditionally, without dependence on past justifications, or it seeming important to her that what she had was distorted. He frankly wishes that she hadn't been, that she'd just been entirely inhuman. Pharasma is just human-shaped enough to care about hurting people, and go do that, instead of just making weird shapes with her resources. If anything, Pharasma stands as an object lesson about why you should never ever try to impart human-like values to a being of godlike power, unless you're certain you can impart them exactly correctly. If he was trying to solve Golarian's problems by figuring out at INT 29 how to construct his own outer god, he'd be constructing that god to solve some particularly narrow problem and not do anything larger that would require copying over his utilities. For fear that if he tried to impart over his actual utility function, the transfer might go slightly wrong, which under pressure of optimization would yield outcomes that were systematically far more wrong, and the result would be something like Pharasma and Golarian in hell. There's no point in trying to blame Pharasma for anything, nor in assigning much blame to mortal Golarian's boneyard children, but somewhere in Pharasma's past may lie some fools who did know some math and really should have known better. Whatever it was they planned to do, they should have asked themselves, maybe, what would happen if something went slightly wrong. People in Dathilan ask themselves what happens if something goes slightly wrong with their plans. That is something they hold themselves responsible about.
That seems like a good opening to contemplate what most of greater reality is like, because not quite an exact copy of human values, with problems introduced in the translation, strikes Carissa as probably an extremely common format out there, if it's something that humans can do just by making a couple of stupid mistakes.
That's literally the largest question they could contemplate. Let's have at it. He does not actually expect that entities with imperfect copies of the values of the things that tried to build it are all that common in greater reality. Pharasma, if she arose that way, happened because her hapless makers lived in a continuum with magic, like Fox's cunning, that adds points to intelligence and wisdom, even if the person casting the spell has absolutely no idea what they're really doing or how the spell works. In non-magical continua like Dathilan, building a scary thing has to be done by weaving together raw causality, like in their magical simulator of magic. This implies that the people making the scary thing have to be more knowledgeable about the thing that they're building. More importantly, it implies that, if they messed up, near misses in formal space would translate into much larger motions across the conceptual space of the scary thing as seen from a mortal viewpoint. That is, if you try to make something like Pharasma in Dathilan, your design plan probably ends up missing the target on dimensions like caring about what happens to living feeling mortals, instead of considering tiny dolls shaped like mortals equally good and much cheaper. And the cheapest instantiations of things that satisfy its utility function aren't self-aware, qualia-bearing entities. Pharasma would be the sort of disaster that happened to hasty makers, who called on spells to produce lots of intelligence by surface-simple conceptual magic means that hid all the underlying complexity, and also invoked poorly tested spells to do the actual targeting of the utility function, where those spells themselves were conceptual magic processes, such that their small design flaws corresponded to small movements across conceptual space. To put it another way, Pharasma's makers, if this whole guess is correct at all, probably got the equivalent of a misphrased Asmodean compact, whose implementation still bore an overt surface resemblance to their exact wording, rather than a misphrased computer program, which goes off and does something completely weird that isn't close to the original intention of the maker inside the space of conceptual descriptions on the output. When you screw up a computer program, it doesn't misspell some words or cook a well-formed tomato stew instead of a carrot stew. It exhibits much weirder behavior than that. Pharasma should be more the sort of thing that you meet inside an artificial magical continuum that makes souls and magic and wisdom into short words of the language of that magical continuum's conceptual magic physics, while hiding the tons of actual complexity that must actually exist underneath that API. And artificial magical continua like that, he does think, ought to be relatively small segments of reality. Dath Ilan was in a mathematically simple universe with visible reality amplitudes at the bottom, which is what you'd expect a base-level structure of relative realness to look like. The magical continuum that embeds Pharasma's creation is presumably in turn embedded in some more mathematically regular universe, resting directly above its own underlying reality fluid, and the magical continuum is probably only instantiated by some small portion of that base physics's reality fluid. Unless, for example, some alien scary thing took over all of its base physics and then decided to use all its resources on simulating a magical continuum, which in turn seems like a decision that ought to be relatively rare, because a simulated magical continuum is not massively economically useful in any obvious way, nor will it occupy a maximum of most possible alien scary thing utility functions. That is to say, you'd expect most of the reality fluid directed by intelligence, in greater reality, to look like it was being directed more by the sort of large entities that might have come to exist in a base-level reality like Dath Ilan's, rather than the sort of medium-sized entities like Pharasma that come to exist in magical continua, that get a small share of a large entity's resources, or maybe very infrequently, a huge share of a large entity's resources. So the question of what greater reality looks like is mostly about which sort of large entities come into existence in mathematically simple physical continua like Dath Ilan, what desires those have, rather than mortals in Galarion, gods in creation, or outer gods in the magical continuum.
Carissa wants to start thinking about greater reality by taking a survey of all of the alien races and civilizations known on Galarion. She started some of that work already because it was obviously going to be useful, but she needs to re-review all of her notes with a bunch of new questions in mind. Her theory is that basically most alien species either evolved or are copies from versions elsewhere who evolved, or were deliberately bred for intelligence by other intelligent species, and especially the ones who evolved or are copied from versions who evolved are the most useful input they have of what kinds of evolved species you might get out there in greater reality. For each of them, it seems hard but not impossible to extrapolate what kinds of civilization they would build, if they had lots of time independently to build civilization. Would they kill outsiders? Trade with them lawfully? Be altruistic towards them? And from there to extrapolate what the distribution of bits of greater reality controlled by the descendants of various evolved civilizations would be. Of course, there will be parts of greater reality not controlled by the descendants of evolved civilizations, like Pharasma's creation. Those will generally be the product of some process that propels something not shaped like the values of the civilization that created it to godhood. Carissa needs to think more about what kinds of processes will propel things not shaped like the values of the civilization that created them to godhood, but from where she's standing, it's not obviously the kind of thing that wouldn't happen without magic. You could just have humans who spend a lot of effort, but not quite enough, teaching their god human values, or humans who ascend themselves but via an ascension process that resolves their muddles slightly badly.
Some of their evidence on how difficult this problem could possibly be is constrained by the fact that Dath Ilan is trying to solve it at all, he infers with confidence, based on the shadow of their policy in which ideas were and weren't removed from public discourse. So it can't look too hard, and they would rather let the planet run for a few decades than try to solve it immediately, so it can't look too easy.
In fact, it seems like if a coherent set of values that come from human values is very hard to define, there might be lots of things that are not quite right for everything that is right, even if there are also lots of things that are sufficiently wrong as to not recognizably have anything of value at all in them. Honestly, the thing Carissa is tempted to do next with that is figure out how to build a non-magic god. Not do it, just figure out how she would, so she can see what the distribution of tries to do it seem like they'd look like. Though also, it seems like while greater reality is probably dominated by simple-to-specify universes, Those seem disproportionately unlikely to be able to do captures of minds from the specific point of their destruction in other, more complex magical universes.
The set of correct spell diagrams for prestidigitation is much smaller than the much larger set of ways to configure prestidigitation that is near right but significantly wrong, which in turn is tiny inside the much vaster space of ways to configure spell diagrams that aren't prestidigitation at all. The much larger space of complete failures doesn't make it impossible to hang prestidigitation. Similarly, within the any success space, the larger proportion of near right but significantly wrong configurations doesn't mean that most prestidigitations hung at all are near right but significantly wrong. The difficult part, and the reason why Dathilan is running so scared, would be getting things right on your first try. But it wouldn't be valid to conclude that a first try, conditioned on it not being completely wrong, probably hits near right but significantly wrong. If you can do something on your first try and not have it go wildly wrong, that's probably because you've invented systematic methods for targeting and error correction, not because you got lucky enough to miss the wildly wrong space. Then the question becomes whether those target locking optimization methods have sufficient narrowing strength, unit bits, to hit the center target and not just exclude the space of complete misses, where most of the work, in some sense, goes into excluding the complete misses, he thinks, having not actually observed that computational landscape. But he has already done some thinking about how many bits it takes to specify the structure and content of a utility function, and the set of errors that give you near misses versus complete misses. He does think she's wrong about simple-to-specify universes not being able to mirror and copy minds from more complicated magic universes. Thought from quantum mechanics, reality fluid in Dathilan, is continuously divisible and ends up in more and more mostly separated worlds interacting, mostly internally, exponentially growing in number and exponentially shrinking in individual size as the greater universe increases in entropy. You can exploit the exponential subdivision of reality fluid to create quantum computations that can only be calculated using exponentially large numbers of computing elements. Quantum phenomena in Dathilan can't be exploited to run arbitrary computations over exponential numbers of computing elements because the motes of quantum reality fluid can't communicate with each other arbitrarily and can't be searched arbitrarily for successful answers. But quantum computations can compute in polynomial time things that require exponential classical time, like factoring large composite numbers. No law of reality known to civilization forbids that a universe with more permissive continuous physics could simulate many, many more complicated magical universes by dividing a bit of reality into very tiny pieces and using those pieces to mirror a whole complicated magical universe. The people inside that universe would exist to only a very tiny degree, but even in Dathilan, it's known that you can set up computations that are only real to a very tiny degree and interact with them to read out their outputs. There are, in fact, famous edgelord philosophical thought experiments about whether it's okay to run harmful experiments on people who are clearly visible to you, but who are only real to some tiny degree because they're inside a quantum setup like that. That said, it's been speculated that the quantum universe is the way it is because of some unknown constraint that weighs against universes whose reality fluid is even more amenable to arbitrary computation via arbitrary divisions. But it's mostly guessed this is an anthropic constraint more than a reality constraint. The higher entities very likely have access to some form of hypercomputation by continuous division of reality, given that they were able to run Dathilan and copy him off it, or that somebody else in the higher causal continuum outside the simulated magical universe was able to do so.
Carissa has a hard time imagining the motives or values of a civilization that would run all possible universes, including universes with hell in them, at very, very minimal reality fluid, in order to take the people in them at the moment of true death and suddenly give them wildly more reality fluid, which seems to be the kind of civilization Keltham is hypothesizing. Even the Carissi wouldn't do that, and they're very, very in favor of making lots and lots of people.
To him, this seems like a totally obvious thing to do. Probably Dathilani civilization is, secretly, planning to do it with a bunch of smaller universes easily contained inside of quantum computers once civilization has safely ascended, unless it's more efficient to engage in cross-universe logical negotiations with other universes that will do that instead. Dath Ilan's universe comes with a built-in time limit before the negative energy, not negative energy, a different kind of negativity, grows too strong and rips everybody apart. He guesses that the actual reason the Keepers told everybody not to worry about that right now is because they expect that a few billion years later, future civilization will have made some logically binding deals with extra-universal entities that are sufficiently visible to them, like entities that started out inside simple but indefinitely continuing physics, which future civilization can accurately simulate well enough to guess which entities that evolve there will stay lawful and have a known utility function to trade with, but whose other universal subclassical illusion physics permits the possibility that they'll later develop computation powerful enough to simulate Dathilon's greater universe exactly, and give those entities more of what they want inside of civilization's reality fluid today, in exchange for them continuing civilization in their own universe after Dath-Ilan's local universe runs down.
Trading for your people to go on existing elsewhere makes sense. But why take the people in such a pocket world out at the moment of true death instead of at literally any other moment? Why let them go on being conscious in hell, but then take them out if hell is destroyed inside their universe? If you're nice, you could just take them out sooner. If you're trading, no reasonable person would trade for that. Carissa would like it very much if other universes made copies of her, but if she goes to hell and gets tortured a lot and deteriorates, she doesn't want the copies to be made from that point. The copies should be made from the point where she is coolest, obviously. She would be actively quite angry with the copiers who could have copied her from the point where she was coolest and decided to copy out a traumatized shell instead.
No doubt there's Carissa copied over to elsewhere to some tiny degree at every moment. But if you're copied over to somewhere else at a 2+41 fraction of your current reality, that mostly doesn't feel like ending up somewhere else. If you wait until almost all of somebody's reality has been destroyed by a plane crash and then copy them, that feels to them like they're going somewhere else. The part where mass numbers of people who die in Galarion end up in hell instead of getting isekai'd, and will have been thoroughly messed up by the time Pharasma's creation runs out. It may come with a known time limit to the gods, though the stories about it sound very distorted and might just be made up. That setup is, he's guessing, an unusually bad situation from the perspective of entities who care about that sort of thing. Bad in a way where they can't just ordinarily catch mind states as they fall out of reality, as they would do with a place like Dathilan. That is, he would guess, part of the story of how Keltham ended up in Galarion, on track to destroy it.
That makes sense, but destroying the universe would then not isekai people. Keltham experienced showing up somewhere else because he died in approximately every single plane crash across all the Dath-Ilans where his plane crashed. If instead 99% of Dath-Ilans had been instantly destroyed, he would find himself in the Dath-Ilans that were not instantly destroyed. The experience that the people in hell will have if Keltham destroys them, treating experiences that feel continuous with the current people as the important thing, which Carissa isn't persuaded of, is of being in hell, in the nearby universes where Keltham didn't land, or where Ottomans noticed or squished him, or where his plan failed, or where he randomly had a heart attack, as does sometimes randomly happen to healthy humans, not often, but often enough. If they want the people currently in hell to have the experience of the pain ceasing and their lives getting better, they have to do that by fixing hell. Otherwise, overwhelmingly, those people's continuity will continue in all the hells that no one touched. Carissa is aware this is also an argument that destroying heaven probably doesn't give people the experience of waking up in an unknown bit of greater reality run by entities that may or may not comprehend the values of the societies that created them, but of going on in the nearest bit of undestroyed heaven. This does make her feel a little better about the whole thing, but she evaluates that as a confused impulse brought about by trying to pay attention to the wrong features of the universe, ones that in normal circumstances overlap heavily with the things she cares about, but which aren't actually the same.
Ideally, he'd knock on the afterlives, such as by making a very loud physical or spiritual sound that everyone hears and remembers hearing at least briefly, egg an explosion or a loud trumpet sound. It's then cheaper for soul-catching elsewheres to rescue the people that heard the sound, even if hell otherwise ends fast enough that people don't notice themselves dying. Though he notes that this is more of an experiential thread utility than an average fate utility. Experiential thread utility. valuing the moment-by-moment trace of what it feels like to be a person, weighted from their reality measure when they first notice their own existences. Average fate utility. For every observer moment in the universe, weighted by its momentary measure, valuing the average experience of all the future observer moments that remember having been that observer moment.
That still seems like there are enough universes in which he succeeds at the trumpet sound but fails at destroying all of reality that she would expect most people who heard such a sound to mostly go into universes where that sound occurred, but the universe wasn't immediately destroyed. Mostly, though, experiential thread theories of what matters feel like an error to her. They're not what she cares about. She appeals to them only to the degree they describe what Keltham cares about. Arguably, Keltham should actually be interested in what the people he is doing this to care about. She understands that he mostly doesn't have a method he believes is accurate to get that answer by asking them, but it seems like a wrong to, as an experiential thread sort of entity, go around doing things to someone that are extremely bad under their own theory of what they care about. She agrees that asking people on the street probably wouldn't work well, but possibly asking ascended mortals would.
He realizes he's updating off evidence fundamentally unshareable with her, but nonetheless notes that from his perspective, when Keltham heard and saw that his plane was about to crash, he ended up in Galarian, not in a complicated fake exception handling scenario in which they'd induced that hallucination or faked that setup for totally justified reasons actually. There were maybe some worlds like that even within Dathilon, but they were rarer than 1 in 1,000, rarer than 1 in a billion, however much rarer they had to be for Galarian to have more reality fluid than that. And Galarian can't have that much reality fluid to start. If he sets up some of the obvious physical phenomena for destroying Pharasma's creation, to be remote detonated from Galarian where prophecy doesn't work, manages to cause some sort of experiential anomaly in hell or all the afterlives, and then tries to blow up the universe. There may be possible and therefore actual states of reality where that doesn't work, but if they're improbable enough, the people in hell don't mostly continue in creation. Creation can't be all that probable in the first place, though of course that also decreases how much caring higher entities are willing to pay to rescue people from creation or destroy it. And that's before taking into account the subjective probability that they're inside a privileged story reality thread, which has much more reality fluid than neighboring non-stories. He agrees that asking an ascended mortal, who must be lawful enough to abide by solid secrecy oaths, is a reasonable experiment. He doubts it swings anything by itself, but it could swing things in combination with other experiments, coming out in the direction Carissa hopes or predicts.
Carissa isn't sure, yet, what exactly is the best articulation of her own values here, and doesn't expect it to be a common articulation even among humans who arrive at one. But she's intending to make her system at least satisfy her intuition that it's extremely different, whether someone arrives at a high average happiness because they are killed in every universe where they are unusually sad, or because they are made happy in every universe.
Among the barriers to himself just taking Galarian mortals' word for it is his concern that Galarianites have now been heritage optimized to not really think about their afterlife futures. If you're told that evil afterlives exist, and their existence implies reproductively suboptimal behavior given your other goals, like for example, not stealing something you could get away with taking because you might go to the abyss, or it being more prudent to donate money to Iomede's church instead of spending that money on dates, then maybe that gets evolved against. Civilization was always very worried about scenarios where it looked like smarter, more altruistic people might end up having fewer kids, lest they breed intelligence, altruism, or actually acting on your philosophy out of themselves. They went to great lengths to avoid it. One of his concerns is that Galarianites have been effectively bred not to think about hell, or not to care about hell, but in a way that doesn't make hell hurt any less once they get there. People in Galarian who think about the near inevitability of some of their kids going to the boneyard, who really care about their kids, might decide not to have kids. And it'd be one thing if people's sanity and intelligence were left intact, but their utility function changed, so that they really and coherently and in a consistent way ended up as a sort of thing that didn't mind the prospect or actuality of hell. But it does not look to him like this is what happened in Galarian. To him it looks more like people grew up knowing about hell, and the more coherent people drastically reshaped their lives in reproductively suboptimal ways given that information, and Golarion bred itself against coherent thinking about hell. Or it could be that Dathilan bred itself for coherence, and Golarion just never got around to it. He can't reliably guess, at this remove from Golarion, and without spending a lot of time tracking down histories of who had how many kids, whether Golarion actively bred against people coherently thinking about their own future, via people learning about hell, or if Dathilan just heritage optimized for smarter, saner people over a couple of dozen generations before their historical screen. Carissa, at this level of intelligence and wisdom, may rationalize that heritage plus the philosophy she developed from growing up in Cheliax as an Asmodean into something that is coherent and that really doesn't mind going to hell. He doesn't currently predict that most other mortals in Golarion would end up with the same philosophy if they were boosted to the same stats. He predicts that their incoherence would fall away from them and they'd become more actually horrified by hell and the boneyard, which would feel much more real to them as their larger minds shrugged off a finite adapted internal pressure against thinking about the future and other people's future experiences as if they were real.
Golarion does seem to have masochism, which isn't exactly heritage modification for hell being, all right, but is quite a step in that direction. A thing that could conceivably be a product of people who are genuinely more all right with bad circumstances and less likely to opt out of them, being more likely to have children for many, many generations of raids and rapes and slavery. But Carissa's best guess, from here, is that people will indeed be more appalled about hell and the boneyard, though the boneyard is fixable without any divine intervention. With diamond manufacture and contraception, you can just make sure babies almost never die and get called right back when they do. She's deeply uncertain about whether that'd make them favor erasing the world. It doesn't seem overdetermined by being appalled about hell. It depends on your estimate of whether it's possible to destroy just hell. She's still confused about what presumptive future Keltham capabilities let him make a trumpet heard all over the universe before painlessly destroying it, but don't let him do that same thing in just hell. Perhaps by compacting with some gods elsewhere so they know how to counteract it in their own domains? And it depends on your estimate of what greater reality is like, and on your estimate of how good lives in heaven and Axis are, and on a lot of other things they haven't yet gotten to. She'd be very surprised if, presented with that, smart humans with lots of time to think all arrived at the same answer, unless there is a clever way to destroy just hell with success near guaranteed. Then, she supposes, they'll all agree on that. Keltham keeps saying that it's overdetermined, that Golarion is so wildly far beyond the line any Dath Ilani would permit to exist. And Carissa's main prediction is that among Golarionites on reflection, wiser and with time to think, it's not overdetermined. They'll be all over the place. Which may not be worth testing at great expense, if it wouldn't be decisive to Keltham, even if true.
He acknowledges the point about masochism, but suspects that hell would need some renovation before even Pilar Pineda could have a good time there. It would not ultimately surprise him if the same story-like forces that dropped Keltham near Carissa at the World Wound would also arrange for Golarion to be clearly over his line, clearly under Carissa's line, and of mixed reception to everybody else in Golarion under intelligence enhancement sufficient to allow them to answer coherently. It could even be that most people in Golarion would end up thinking a different thing, given wishes and an artifact headband, depending on whether he talked them through the growing up process, or Carissa did. It may, in fact, not be decisive to him, because of his sense that there are people in hell who wouldn't want to be there, and they get a kind of veto power over the whole arrangement. A trade arrangement that leaves 9 people better off and 1 person worse off is not, in the end, a voluntary trade. From his perspective, Pharasma is just a kind of thing that makes unfair trades, because she doesn't think the little things can threaten her, and she has no right to object if he makes her stop existing about that. He is not just destroying what he'd rather not exist, he is refusing a trade that didn't get buy-in from the participants. Maybe it would be the case that if there was only 1 person in hell, they shouldn't get veto power over all of creation. Though there is an old parable in Dathilan about a city of 1,000,000 happy people and 1,000 forsaken miserable children and a democratic supermajority vote, whose point is that democratic supermajority does not make right. But it goes back to the question of ratios. Again, he is ready to call off a trade if it screws 1 person out of 100, and his threshold definitely isn't 1 in 10. He does still think that they're supposed to make a list of everything they can test and figure out how to test it all least expensively, and then spend some amount of bounded resource on running the tests with the greatest value of information, including how they potentially lead to spending more resources and running other tests. That's just common sense.
Yes, definitely. She's noting the experiment ideas as they run across them, just in case. She does observe that the decision isn't between destroying everything to destroy the people in hell or doing nothing about hell. It's about the difference between the odds of success of this plan at destroying hell and the odds of success of the next best plan for destroying or fixing hell. So the question is not whether destroying the universe is better than nothing by Keltham's values, but whether it's better than a less certain, narrower intervention that leaves the other afterlives intact. She doesn't expect to convince Keltham that not destroying the universe is better than destroying the universe. She does hope to convince him that destroying the universe is much, much, much more bad than she thinks he currently conceives of it, so that he is more willing to trade off some chance of success for a plan with a narrower scope.
It actually does seem to him to be a lot easier to destroy creation than to destroy just hell. He doesn't actually have solid plans for getting a trumpet call. That was just a hypothetical example based on Galarian announcement protocols, into the 8th layer of hell. That was something he expects he'll end up mostly leaving to his future divine self. His primary hope is that releasing Rovagug is the sort of thing that will cause a consciously perceptible change of experience within hell, including via side avenues like by Asmodeus leaving hell to fight Rovagug. His backup non-concrete plan is for his divine self to negotiate with lawful good entities about that. To destroy creation, he probably just needs to destroy Pharasma's infrastructure in the Boneyard Continuum, her seal and her spire, though he will also try to simultaneously destroy as many material planes as he can. Asmodeus has worked hard to make it pragmatically unsolvable to destroy the center of his presence on the 9th layer of hell without also destroying creation. Asmodeus has probably not put in the same effort to make it impossible to cause a loud noise or other perceptible disturbance in the first 8 layers of hell. He's got plans for getting Carissa's family out of Cheliax and into Elysium before he unleashes Rovagug, obviously, along with everyone else in Galarian he knows or cares about, basically boiling down to wishnapping them there. It is a sort of thing where he was not sure whether Carissa would let herself think about that or not.
Carissa suspects it won't matter. She has thought about it. It's hard not to, and she thinks that while the chaotic planes are said to be infinite, the reachable bits of them will all go with creation if it goes. The parts that survive will be, well, infinitely far away. It might help in the case where Rovagug is unleashed and Galarian destroyed, but not all of creation, and seems worth doing for that circumstance, though in that circumstance they're also probably resurrectable. But she thought about it for a while and considers it unlikely that the parts of Elysium and the Maelstrom that any Galarianites go to would outlive the universe. Her feelings about this, which she has a very strong habit of hiding from Keltham, and which are crying out in misery at being observed here and now, are fairly mixed. Of course, it's better to do slightly less expected harm than slightly more, but it's less than 1/1,000,000th of the harm averted, and wildly more than 1/1,000,000th of the emotionally significant to Keltham harm averted. And that makes her scared that he'll be more willing to do it, what with how he's primarily risking the people he's never met or cared for. When she was planning to destroy Cheliax to buy them another month of time, she considered and rejected getting anyone she loved out. If she wasn't willing to do it to them, she felt, she shouldn't be willing to do it at all. Instead of her family, maybe Keltham should just pick 4 random people to wishnap to Elysium. It'd do exactly as much harm reduction, and it wouldn't deceive the parts of their minds that can only conceive of bad things on human scales. Maybe none of that actually coheres, but she thinks it does, or is a pointer to something that does. She thinks that part of the deontology of a world of Carissa would be that anyone in one of those who decided it was worth bombing a city did not get themselves or their loved ones to safety first.
He doesn't know if she'll listen to him, but he wants to suggest to her, as a woman once said to past Keltham, that she is allowed to be a little selfish. He knows that she will have already thought of this obvious thought, and rejected it, but he nonetheless wants to say it to her, what she'll have already predicted, he'll say. The infinity of the chaotic planes does strongly suggest to him that they're more continuous with the territory outside creation than the other planes. Carissa might want to learn the entirety of his physics knowledge, though it's clear that local physics are modified from that, and then reconsider whatever Galarian evidence she has. He'll want to review her relevant Galarian knowledge too, but it might lack the crisp, clear formality of physics, and so be less learnable by him at low expense. From a Dath Ilani perspective, it would be a generically obvious sort of tactic, at this point, to collect some Galarianites and a repository of their culture and put them into an ark in Elysium, with spell silver on board, and diamonds and some helpful magic items, and maybe an Afriti noble bound by oaths. Try to maximize their chance of surviving if Elysium comes unanchored from creation but isn't destroyed instantaneously. If he's doing that anyways, he'd obviously put Carissa's family on board by default. Telling him not to do that, in hopes he'll be influenced by her and her family's greater jeopardy, seems threatish in the decision-theoretic sense. He might acquiesce to leave Carissa's family behind if Carissa demanded it be so, for the sake of peace between them, but he'd then ignore the influence on his decisions from that. Making the outcome be worse for him than he could otherwise make it be for himself, in hopes that it'll influence him, is something he should respond to by not being so influenced. Maybe Carissa wants to bind herself that way, by not getting her family out of jeopardy. Though this seems to him like questionable altruism, her family does not belong to her like her clothes do, but she definitely shouldn't hope to bind him that way, by putting in more jeopardy what he could put into less jeopardy. A side thought, thinking to himself, possibly delegate the Ark project to Fëanor, maybe wish up Fëanor, and give him some now unused headbands to be a better leader. Iomede's transcension via Starstone generated artifacts from the magic items she was carrying with her at the time. Maybe they can do something similar with their headbands and/or the giant diamonds entrusted to Fëanor. Obtain a large existing airship or larger regular boat and commission emergency speed crafting on it, add magic items to it, to try to make it more planner survival worthy. He may want to put Fëanor on that project soon. There could be lead time on Fëanor obtaining a ship.
Carissa isn't sure, actually, that if you're doing something like this, you're allowed to be a little bit selfish. She isn't sure that you aren't either. She is aware of her own bias to solve moral problems in a way that involves suffering whenever that is humanly possible, and sometimes when it isn't. But it feels to her like all the trillions of people you are going to kill have the right to demand of you that you do the best possible version of your plan, that if you are unwilling to do whatever it takes to try not to have to kill them, then you aren't grown up enough, yet, to do it at all. Probably it's fine to do things like saving her family that don't affect the odds of success of the overall plan. But everything's entangled, and she's not sure there are things that don't affect the odds of success of the overall plan. It won't affect whether Keltham is willing to go ahead, maybe, but say that Pharasma is willing to grant him an end to hell and nothing else he demanded, and he has to decide whether to annihilate the universe over that or not. She can't actually bring herself to wish that the universe whose annihilation he contemplates holds nothing of particular importance to him anymore.
Even leaving aside that he's unlikely to end up relatively certain that an Elysium Ark survives the destruction of creation, her family is not going to swing this. Even the other Project Lawful members are not going to swing this if he can wish-nap them to the putative Ark. Carissa won't be on that Ark, and she is and always has been the thing about Galarion that felt the most real to him.
In that case, she is grateful that he thought about her family, and if it'd be helpful, she'll plan Fëanor's Ark with him at some point. Fëanor does seem like a good person to do it. This is only sort of an accurate explanation of how she feels. She is trying to produce cooperativeness and gratitude and positive reinforcement for Keltham out of a well of recently deafened agony and isn't totally sure it's working. But she hopes it's working.
There's a protocol out of Dath Ilan which might help here, which is that she's allowed to say, for example, I acknowledge the thought, and am glad we're still coordinating, but can't feel gratitude right now, and this serves a lot of the same purpose of not appearing to Keltham as a blank non-reinforcement of behavior she wants him to repeat, without requiring her to feel particular things. He's not looking for a feeling of gratitude from her, for people can't, or at WIS 25+, should not too often, choose what to feel. More like the acknowledgement that he made or was trying to make a cooperative move in their multiplayer dilemma, including one that was on the level of people and feelings. So long as that acknowledgement is there in any form, it doesn't need to take the form of an emotion she has to struggle to produce within herself.
She's still trying to be extremely selective about which bits of alien technology she adopts into herself. But that is the language Keltham so wishes he could hear. So, yes. She acknowledges that he is cooperating, that he is trying very hard, even when it is costly to him, and that she noticed him doing that just now. In addition to having a background presumption, he's doing it even when she doesn't notice.
He acknowledges that in turn. They're clear at this point that Dath Ilan's alien technology is just alien and not secretly meant to corrupt lawful evil targets. Check? He's reasonably certain at this point that he understands everything about Dath Ilan that looked sinister to the likes of Cheliax and Osirion. The sneakiest thing Dath Ilan did was covertly shape him to never notice he was a sadist, and they didn't do that in a way that hindered his adaptation in a world with masochists. Now that he thinks about that at this intelligence level, that's weak evidence that Dath Ilan has masochists, but very few, and they didn't want to hinder the sexuality of sadists who could end up affording them. Obviously, past Keltham was shaped in all sorts of ways as a kid, but those shaping targets are matters of public documentation on the network. They're not covert intended effects of the alien technology. Even the height of Dath Ilan's cleverness shouldn't be able to steganograph mind control tactics that could influence augmented Carissa, without his own augmented self being able to notice, through the sole medium of techniques simple enough to be taught to past Keltham. To speak only of capabilities, saying nothing of intention, as would require knowledge. Past Keltham was clearly not prepped for the Cheliax scenario he landed in.
Carissa agrees with all that, and would be making different trade-offs if she disagreed with any of it. And still, if the situation were any less dire, she would not be trying to replace her own instincts and responses with those of an alien civilization whose values are in fact very different from hers. And she checks internally every time she does that, if it's actually necessary to do and if the implementation is tugging at any related bits of her head. She imagines if Keltham were in a civilization with vastly more advanced mental technology, where everyone preferred hell to death and cared mostly about how many universes they existed in, and was a masochist, he too would develop some kind of mental checklist when adopting their alien thought patterns, and might feel sad that it was necessary to do it all.
It would depend greatly on whether the purpose of everything in that civilization was clearly labeled. Past Keltham didn't hesitate to learn any of Carissa's alien technology, which did have more risk than he realized, but he was mistakenly treating a low-trust society like a high-trust society, and Cheliax's lessons to him were not overt in their true purposes. There is, in general, in Dath Ilan, an ethos that the protagonist is supposed to immediately learn any and all amazing mental tricks the aliens possess, and analyze them and judge them and repurpose them if necessary. He's reasonably certain that's not a subtle trap aimed at causing aliens who pick up Dath Ilani to think it's a good idea to rapidly learn from the Dath Ilani.
She wonders if they're perhaps quibbling over this because it touches on a deeper thing, where Carissa, on an emotional level, views Dath Ilan as not really the kind of civilization you cooperate with if you have any choices other than cooperation and death. She has tried quite hard to not make this Keltham's problem. She has not asked again that he talk less about Dath Ilan, but when they're mind-reading, it's hard to hide. Carissa views Dath Ilan as something that should be forcibly cryopreserved, ideally.
He wishes to see those thoughts, guessing them would take more time than looking.
The people of Dath Ilan are obviously not alien the way Asmodeus is alien. They have many human impulses. They have lots in common with many people of Golarion. But a gesture at the concept that things that are similar until you optimize them aggressively enough can then end up extremely distant from each other. Dath Ilan has resolved a lot of their muddles, and in almost every case resolved them in the opposite of the way Carissa herself resolves them. And so in this world, and she suspects in most worlds, the things that Carissa wants and the things Dath Ilan wants are very, very different. She thinks she'd probably be reasonably happy in a Dath Ilani utopia, and that they'd probably be reasonably happy in a Carissa-ish utopia, but in any world short of that, their aims will be diametrically different, and there being Dath Ilani around makes it less likely that anything at all of value to Carissa will be preserved. Keltham is very, very much not a Carissa utility inverter. He's just for unrelated reasons reasonably likely to do the precise thing a Carissa utility inverter would do, and Dathilani, as she understands it, would nearly all do that. And so to Carissa, as a pragmatic matter, they aren't very different from Rovagug or from a Carissa utility inverter. The best thing to do about them is to render them unable to hurt anyone while you try to make the world a place so good it has space even for them in it.
More puzzlement that he can probably resolve faster by looking than by guessing himself. Seeing evidence first and hypothesizing later is not as deadly to him now as when he was smaller. What would Carissa do differently, rather than teach differently or think about differently, if she had great political power in modern Dathilan as it is? Would she tell all the sadists what they are, and let them be sad sadists? Enslave people to be used as victims who wouldn't enjoy that?
Probably let them be sad, yes. She thinks it's actually much better to be sad than to be muddled. And probably she'd let people set to be forcibly cryopreserved choose to be enslaved instead, with an ongoing choice about that, though she understands it to be the case that probably few Dathilani would go for it. But it also feels to her like something has gone very wrong to put those things into such tension. One of the ways in which Dathilani are very alien to Carissa is that they would, in fact, be worse off from having a bit more wisdom and noticing an obvious fact about their own minds and desires. It makes it hard to say you'd do anything in particular to make them predict reality better or understand themselves better. After all, it can be stipulated that then they'll be sad. She thinks mostly she'd change all the heritage optimization to be pointed very aggressively at that. At the way Dathilani are so, the words that immediately come to mind are so fragile and so miserable. But she understands Keltham is homesick, and she would not have said those aloud, so configured such that realizing they want things they can't have makes them lastingly worse off, and so frequently sad, maybe, is what she'd have said. She would have said to them that they'd accidentally optimized out a ton of really valuable stuff, further info available on request, and that the highest priority for the next generation would be getting it back.
He suspects that Dathilan's ancestors damaged themselves in the process of trying heritage optimization, while knowing far less than they know now. Subsystems of the brain compete for volume, for attention. To make one subsystem louder can diminish the relative voice of another by comparison. There are known syndromes like that. Dathilan's ancestors, he now suspects, infers at this distant remove, blundered into a trade-off like that in the course of optimizing for reflectivity, which is entangled with the relative loudness of prefrontal cortex compared to subcortical emotion-binding structures. Past Keltham knew he had more emotional intensity than the Dathilani around him. This probably correlated with past Keltham having Galarian measurable wisdom well below Dathilani average, he is guessing. The smart people of Dathilan may already know as much, even if they don't calculate that it would be helpful to emphasize a lot in public that people ought to have louder emotions, as would give people one more thing to be sad about. Fixing Dathilan, he currently guesses, would be mainly a matter of heritage optimizing or biochemically intervening for more subcortical loudness. A component of local measured splendor probably, given how wishes that boosted measured splendor also boosted that. He'd advocate that policy himself, now that he's had a chance to look at Galarian. He suspects it's already in progress there, at least a little. Dath-Ilan may not prioritize that characteristic as much as he would, having seen Galarian, but Dath-Ilan has some idea that they've got a problem. This does not yet seem like the part that you'd cryopreserve civilization over. His model of Carissa would never say they're too sad to be allowed to exist.
That makes her feel a spark of fondness, which she squelches out half-automatically. Indeed, no one is too sad to be allowed to exist. They can go along as miserably as they want. No, the only acceptable reason to cryopreserve civilization is in self-defense. If it learns of worlds like hers, worlds where most people have good lives and amazing afterlives, but some people have good lives and go to hell, it will annihilate them. If there was nothing else in the entire greater reality, then it'd be better to have Dathilan than nothing.
That gets into a rather larger issue, as he'd frame it. Dathilan is only one instance of a much larger class of agents here, and that larger class is probably what's impinging on Galarian. This is a large thought. He requests that they pause on active interchange for long enough that he can think it through.
Carissa can, actually, at this wisdom level, just stop all her contentious, world-destroying related thoughts and think about the sensation of having fingers and joints, being able to shift her weight, being able to breathe. It's delightful. It is nice how some things are exactly the same as when she was a very small Carissa. Keltham can take his time.
There's a lot of different hypothetical ways to slice up the alien superintelligences that constitute the powers of greater reality, and at this weak level of augmentation, he just doesn't have the time or computing power to derive a serious estimate about the real landscape from scratch. The large thought that follows is properly framed against the magnitude of this difficulty of guessing.
Greater reality, according to Keltham, Irwin. In different universes with different physics, there will be things that don't develop neuron analogs as a whole new computation substrate on top of their genes, and instead compute with their equivalent of DNA and pass memories and skills on to children. Aliens like that would be very different from Dath Ilani, or from the Galarianites copied from a common ancestor of their humanity. Some such species of things won't transcend by constructing computers from scratch, but by accumulating enough DNA skills like that over time, or coming up with some adaptation for exchanging DNA skills horizontally, until in the midst of all those DNA analog-born skills collected of their species, a greater coherence and reflection is born and a self-optimization. A superintelligence born that way would be very, very different from Dath Ilani or Galarianites. Some possible laws of physics will put much larger subvolumes of reality into causal neighborhoods of each other, compared with how on a planet things only touch their immediate neighbors in 3 dimensions of space. Some coherent mathematical causal relations over relative reality, another way of saying laws of physics, will do the equivalent of creating vast numbers of computer programs that immediately start copying and eating each other, or competing for memory, Googles of them all touching each other within a confined space, such that a superintelligence is born from those almost immediately, rather than requiring a long time to evolve. A superintelligence born that way, from a universe like that one, would be very, very different from anything that evolved anywhere, or that had been born out of a process itself evolved. With that warning in mind, that large segments of greater reality are probably really alien, much more so than the outer gods, one of many, many potential theoretical ways to slice up the space of alien superintelligences might be to talk of 3 kinds of entities. 1. Entities that only care about their own experiences or reality fluid in their own immediate vicinity of causality, spacetime. Call these locally caring entities. 2. Entities that care about reality fluid regardless of whether it's in their own vicinity, such that compared to a baseline of a null simple or typical average configuration of reality fluid, their best configuration of that reality fluid gives them a much larger relative positive bonus than the relative negative loss of the worst possible configuration of that reality fluid. For concreteness, suppose that compared to the way most reality fluid everywhere they can affect is put together by default, putting it together their best possible way scores a gain of plus 100 eutolons, and putting it together the worst possible way loses 1 eutolons. Call these positively caring entities. 3. Entities that care about reality fluid not only in their immediate vicinity, which can lose a lot more from the worst configuration of that reality fluid compared to null baseline, than they can gain from the best configuration of that reality fluid. They take a random bit of reality they can affect in any physical or logical way, the way it usually is, and make it the best way a bit of reality fluid can be. They gain plus 1 eutolon over baseline. Make it the worst way it can be according to their utility function, and they lose 100 eutolons under baseline. Call these negatively caring entities. Considering the imaginable case where greater reality degenerated into beings mostly trying to extort and blackmail and threaten and retaliate against each other, doing the worst they could do to one another, spending lots of effort on pessimizing each other's utility functions. The locals would defend their own bubbles of reality and not care about anything outside of that. The positives would be slightly sad, and the negatives would go to extreme lengths to prevent that possibility from ever materializing. Then, one might speculate, all of the negatively caring entities that didn't have very strongly opposing utility functions and had logical line of sight on one another sufficient to engage in binding logical negotiations would have a potential target of logical coordination that could perhaps be summed up as no pessimizing the utility function of anybody within this coalition. Of course, any particular negatively caring entity would only care directly to avoid having its own or similar utility functions pessimized. But the entities large enough to extrapolate distant entities that could in turn extrapolate themselves might execute a logically binding agreement to act against almost any utility pessimizer they ran across, even one that wasn't targeting their own utility function, if that pessimizer was targeting a utility function likely to reappear within the coalition. They would have an incentive even to oppose whatever it was that flipped Dubral to Zonkuthan, or, on a smaller scale, Asmodeus figuring out what mortals like least, and doing that to them. It's not in this case that the mortals are part of the mutually negotiating coalition. The mortals don't have logical line of sight on the negative entities. The mortals cannot cooperate in a way that is logically dependent upon the entities cooperating back. Possibly even Dubral as he then existed would not have possessed the cognitive resource to extrapolate negative entities in enough detail that he could have made a logical compact that bound them, chosen to prevent pessimization of their utility functions only if they would do the same for his utility function. But the mortals have greater nephews. Powers such as Dathilon might have one day birthed future civilizations elsewhere in greater reality. And those powers predictably have their own utility functions pessimized, to some degree, when Dubral gets flipped to Zonkuthan or Asmodeus tortures mortals. Even positively skewed Buscaring entities have an incentive to not allow pessimizers to exist. They can be hurt too when reality fluid gets configured the way they like least if their positive skew is not total. But their incentive to wipe pessimizers out of reality is much relatively weaker than it is for negatively skewed Buscaring entities. Negatively skewed caring entities will engage in negotiations to remove Zonkuthan or whatever flipped Dubral from reality, even if those negotiations incur large uncertainties and inefficiencies. Before meeting Carissa, past Keltham would have considered it obvious that human beings are negatively caring entities, in both their local and non-local components. He still thinks most of the people in Golarion would qualify as negatively caring, based on other reading and conversations, and that the unusual woman he landed next to at the World Wound will prove to be odd about that. For most people, the very worst thing that can happen to them or to anyone is worse than the best thing that can happen is good. The larger entity that created the magical continuum that contains Pharasma's creation is locally skewed plus caring, as is Pharasma. Reasoning. Pharasma is large enough that she should be able to extrapolate at least some distant entities that could extrapolate her and engage in logically binding negotiations with those. Golarion does not look like it should look if Pharasma were trading with those distant entities. Similarly, if the larger entity wasn't local, it'd have traded with distant entities in ways that would have visibly shaped the magical continuum, and would have imposed constraints on Pharasma's creation and Golarion. Wherever they are right now, it's not a trading equilibrium of lots of entities, it's something's personal backyard. Pharasma's creation, however, is an exceptional pit of horror from the perspective of the negatively caring coalition. Mortals don't just live miserable lives and die, they live miserable lives and then get tortured in the afterlife into wrecks that might be hard to rescue by continuing simulation. Those mortals are not in the class of agents with which negatively caring entities true negotiate, execute mutually binding logical arrangements. But sending mortals to hell is going to pessimize the utility functions of many particular kinds of negatively caring entities, like those entities born of a place like Dathilon. This is an easy fact for any large negatively caring entity to extrapolate. A future civilization, when it grows up and can engage in logical negotiations of its own, will not wantonly step on and crush the utility functions of any large entities with lots of reality fluid, whose utility functions are easy to foresee. If it's predictable that some foreseeable classes of entity would hate the imprisonment of mitochondria inside of cells, future civilization will arrange that there are no imprisoned mitochondria. And in return, it will be logically bargained, and only logically conditional on that bargain's predictable execution will future civilization make its concessions. In return, negatively caring entities that run across some event future civilization and its logical kin would hate will try to prevent that event from happening. So a negatively caring entity that happened to be standing next to the entity operating the magical continuum bargained for something to be done about Pharasma's creation inside. Possibly only after a rodent died and some other future remedy was derailed. That's his basic guess as to what happened here, what's really going on. The entities that made the magical continuum care about it locally and in a weird way. The magical continuum is not being efficient at any ordinary instrumental goal. The makers prevent Pharasma and her fellow outer gods from being eaten by superintelligences. The little outer gods have a garden to play in undisturbed. Similarly, the makers probably locally cared about and optimized for the creations of outer gods containing many mortals who didn't just get consumed for their resource value or externally uplifted to technological civilizations. The makers could intervene at any point, yet they intervene almost nowhere, their actions almost entirely null. Just like Pharasma mostly doesn't intervene in her creation, and the gods mostly don't intervene in Galarian. It's against this background that the incredible weirdness of Keltham insertion as an intervention needs to be considered. A negatively caring entity with some foreseeable utility function paid for that intervention on behalf of everything like future civilization that would consider Pharasma's creation as a really unusually bad place. By the standards of greater reality within which it is to be hoped, most entities are optimizing their own utility functions, rather than spending lots of their resources on pessimizing other entities' utility functions. It's not an unreasonable outcome to hope for. Most entities have reason to want greater reality to end up that way, though the negatively caring entities have a much stronger reason to want it. But paid as little as possible, of course, for the intervention that would annoy the makers least, cause them the least loss of utility for which they'd demand compensation. The negatively caring entity didn't pay the makers to send in a superintelligence, nor to send a keeper to Absalom. That, presumably, would have been much more contrary to the makers' locally caring utility function, and demanded a higher price than dropping Keltham next to Carissa at the World Wound. This theory obviously does not compress all of the evidence available to them that looks like it ought to be compressible. In particular, Galarion's past weirdness, such as might be pleasing to the makers, seems different in character from the strangeness of past Keltham Landing, where he'd end up with multiple romantic prospects. Though he hasn't been staring too directly at that himself, because it seems like it might also have been a Caden Kalian tactic to arrange some of that tropiness. He knew that future augmented Carissa would be able to think about that more safely than himself if it needed thinking about. But it's an obvious thought that the negatively caring entity that sent past Keltham into Galarian might have split the cost with something that had strange preferences about isekai stories, so long as they were arranging an isekai at all, or something. He does not, in fact, expect to succeed in decoding what actually went on there at his current level of augmentation. But, depending on the size of the maker's causally connected local section of their higher universe, in terms of how many different entities are active traders there could be something in there that erupted out of a civilization that got stuck in some weird equilibrium where it poured more and more resources into an increasingly sophisticated, interactive isekai romance. Say, because that civilization was even worse than Galarion at handling existential threats like the World Wound, and the interactive romance novel succeeded in being a romantic superstimulus to the species' members, and was therefore an extremely selfish, profitable investment of computation, and they managed to pour billions of labor hours into that company, but not into the public good of surviving their own transcendence. That level of coordination failure would have seemed implausible to him before Galarian, but now he buys that as a plausible dysfunction mode for aliens. The resulting entity which ate that civilization then cared a lot about having isekais look more like romance novels. It's more likely that one such isekai entity exists within causal contact of the makers of the magical continuum, if there's a lot of entities in mutual causal contact with the makers, but this doesn't seem implausible. The kind of computations the makers are throwing around do not seem characteristic of three-dimensional space with a tight light speed limit. The isekai entity might care more about natural versions of those events than those it arranged for itself, due to having evolved some earlier taste for the natural, or a prohibition against tickling its own rewards, as its makers might have tried and not totally failed to imbue into it. Or it could be a negatively skewed caring entity, which made for itself quintillions of the cheapest events it classified as isekais, but would still be very unhappy about any isekai-categorized event occurring anywhere that wasn't a correctly designed romance novel. The isekai entity would of course refuse to pay to modify isekai events that were planned only as threats to itself, but the original negative entity's paid intervention into Galarian would have been an isekai purely of that negative entity's own natural interest. It would not have started as an isekai only for purposes of threat, so the isekais must be Romance's entity paid to further modify those events. Paid a lot, because it wouldn't run across naturally occurring isekais in need of fixing very often and would have a lot of generalized money to spend on that.
He realizes it's not a good theory. He's just keeping it in mind so that he has a probably false theory he can use to organize his evidence, and at least notice when something contradicts or confirms that theory, rather than leaving his observations wholly unorganized and untheorized.
It's a very Keltham theory. She agrees that it's not a good theory. While it does seem to her like Keltham-related events have a distinct character from the events of Galarian's history, that feels mostly fully explained by Caden and Nethys's meddling, plus the degree to which a legend out of history gets distorted by the retelling. She's less sure than Keltham that greater reality isn't mostly local, entities creating their own universes that run by their rules. It doesn't seem like a natural thing, after all, to care about things happening in other universes. It feels like resolving a muddle in a particular way where you might expect most people not to. What's Keltham's theory on why entities would care about things outside themselves, in general, anyway, or at least why humans do it?
He doesn't stare too hard at Caden Nethys, so that's Carissa's future job if it produces relevant factors. He was trying to reason mainly from Pilar's, Carissa's, and Asmodea's prior improbability in their base characters before any divine meddling started. He's reasoning from the improbability of Pilar's potential for tropian stories, rather than the Caden meddling realization of that potential. Caring about everything everywhere that matches a pattern is computationally simpler than caring about only things that match the pattern in a particular region of space. Also, if you only care about a short time in the future, somebody will trade you a small amount of resources today for all of your resources later, which eliminates you as a lasting power of reality. Or, caring about experiences of the self requires defining self, and if that definition cuts off all strong growth and self-modification, that entity is again filtered away as a strong power of reality. Or, things that get optimized into existence by something like natural selection, which is trying to solve a problem in an environment, may well end up caring about something in the environment, or rather being made up of a muddle that could easily shake out that way for at least some things. That's how it happened for humans, leaving out some complexities of reflection towards coherence along the way. There's nothing forcing an agent to shake out that way, but it is simple to care about every part of reality by running your utility function over its configuration, and if a component of many humans' values lands there, then plausibly so do a bunch of other things' components. Even if reality did end as mostly entities that were mostly locally caring, the non-local entities would still trade with each other. Trade-optimized regions would then just be a smaller total fraction of greater reality's dispensation of its intelligently controlled reality fluid.
Carissa agrees that something probably not Kaiden put Pilar there as well as Carissa. Asmodea feels less suspicious. To Carissa, as a person, Asmodea seems like the kind of person lots of people are, except that maybe someone had to be a person who'd say to Carissa that they wanted to not exist, so that she could understand that as something a person might actually want for themselves and not just want inflicted on others, so that she wouldn't report Keltham to Asmodeus the instant she realized that his plan might destroy the world. She understands that natural selection produces muddles which can then shake out in many, many ways that aren't what created an advantage in the selected environment, and probably other processes for producing intelligent beings, breeding them deliberately, would do the same thing. It still seems like there are powerful forces in the direction of caring about yourself and your family and your nation and your species more than you care about all sapients. She expects most evolved creatures not to care about everybody, though tentatively.
Asmodea was oddly adept at learning the more mathematical parts of law, for somebody to just happen to be in the same class as Pilar. The second group, sent over when Cheliax assigned the project a higher priority and was trying to allocate smarter people instead of gift girls, didn't seem to contain another Asmodea.
Lots and lots of evolved things, and probably even more of the entities that the evolved beings birth, if they mess it up, would end up not caring about sentient beings at all, whether locally or everywhere. The categorization he's suggesting generalizes beyond caring about sentience. For example, suppose some being cares a lot about particular shapes of matter, for example, and prefers matter being curled up in one squiggle shape, a rounded rectangular spiral pattern, say, while greatly wishing that no pattern ever be squiggled up in a hyperbolic spiral. It might feel no pain or pleasure, no joy or happiness about the fact. It might just act so as to bring about the rounded rectangular squiggles and avoid the hyperbolic spirals. Or it might feel pain or pleasure internally, as it learns about spirals or squiggles being created, but be indifferent to this as it plots its goals. From the perspective of the squiggle-carrying entity, some other entity that cares a lot about people having conscious experiences is then just a strange being that cares about some weird and more abstract and complicated pattern that matter can be squiggled into. Playing out some additional particulars in case the abstract pattern didn't make it across the telepathic gap at the speed they're trying to think at each other. That entity would be categorized as negative skewed or positive skewed in that utterly sentient, uncaring utility function, depending on whether one ill-shaped squiggle pattern cancels out the utility of 100 good squiggles or 0.01 good squiggles. A negatively skewed squiggle entity, whose utility function arose in any way suggesting that this utility function arises more often in greater reality than its positive inverse, has incentive to be signatory to a compact whereby the future of Dath Ilan's civilization would spend lots of resources to intervene if future civilization ran across some smaller thing that also really hated hyperbolic spirals, and some mid-sized pessimizing entity was therefore making lots of hyperbolic spirals because it had decided to pessimize the smaller agent's utility, maybe after making a threat that was decision theoretically properly refused and having evolved to be hateful itself. A future civilization wouldn't care about hyperbolic spirals as such, and the smaller thing might not be a kind of being that experienced unhappiness as such, or had even chosen to have any conscious experiences at all. But in return, the original larger squiggle entity would intervene if it saw somebody torturing a mortal, not because it cared, not even because the mortal was trading with it, but because future civilization had agreed to avert the pessimization of negatively skewed entities in general, conditional on its expectation that a lot of negatively skewed entities would do the same, and entities signatory to that compact were expected to occasionally avert small or large squiggle-carrying beings from being pessimized by having lots of hyperbolic spirals created at them. A logical trade like that comes with friction costs. So negatively skewed entities are more likely to be signatory to a pact like that than positively skewed entities, because even if they only assess a 10% chance of future civilization actually existing to execute the bargain that they predict future civilization to execute if it exists, and even if they expect future civilization to underestimate by a factor of 10 how much the negatively skewed squiggle carrier exists to pay them back, it's still worth sacrificing the opportunity cost of 100 rounded rectangle squiggles to prevent one expected hyperbolic spiral from being made. A positively skewed squiggle carrier would conversely demand 100 units of reality fluid be spent on preventing hyperbolic spirals in order to justify sacrificing 1 unit of reality fluid that could have been spent directly on rounded rectangular squiggles.
She doesn't want to invest too much in contemplating how, as a god, she'd handle that problem, when it's a probably wrong model Keltham sketched out and probably not a description of actual reality. But it is the bleakest possible imagining of the universe, that it's mostly full of entities who'd consider the universe not existing to be among the best possible outcomes, who are set up structurally such that almost everything that could possibly happen is bad, and all the good things are worth losing to slightly reduce the chance of bad ones. Pharasma and the winning god coalition destroyed the gods that sided with Rovagug, and she would do the same thing to entities that would side with Rovagug, if she could. Probably in some universes, Rovagug and the gods that sided with him won and everything got eaten, and she's not in those universes because they don't exist. And she understands how that counts as triumph for some people, how they might just want to peel more and more Galarians away from the branch where people live and die and love and fight and laugh and cry and squeeze them dead and make the Galarians-eaten branch of the tree a little thicker. But it's not what she wants.
Negatively skewed universal carers don't need to end up wishing that somebody would erase their universes, unless they really hate the way that reachable matter is shaped by default, compared to it not existing. But hopefully such beings are few, or configured in such a way that they're not experiencing constant suffering about that. He himself wouldn't want them to be unhappy, though it's not like they themselves need care about unhappiness. So long as reality isn't allowed to end up full of Zon Kuthons and Asmodeuses and other such utility function pessimizers, most entities, even negatively skewed ones, could mostly be getting things they want and not things they hate. People who feel like reality loses more when one person gets crushed and tortured than when 10 people lead happy lives aren't necessarily out to destroy reality. If no one is being tortured, there isn't a problem. Or rather, if nobody reachable is being tortured, there isn't a problem you can solve by destroying the local universe, and you might as well not think about it or be sad about it either. Civilization would have fought to defend itself from destruction, and did fight to defend itself. Because while there were possible states of matter that would lose more, compared to a null state of lifeless matter, than the best states of matter would gain, they managed to stop those bad things from happening and be mostly happy. That's the grand dream and vision, from the negative standpoint, that reality not contain a lot of utility function pessimizers running around and occasionally pessimizing beings with utility functions similar to their own, so that reality as a whole is something they're still glad to have around. That's why Pharasma is being given an out. She doesn't need to have her creation destroyed if she's willing to have it not contain such a large element of utility function pessimization.
That did actually occur to Carissa, or something like it, when she first decided not to betray Keltham and to come to him instead. She thinks she may have made an error there, but it seemed to her that Golarion would not really endure for the forever she wanted for it, while it had hell in it. That even if she warned them and they crushed Keltham, there would be another like him someday. That the only way for Golarion to endure forever, like she wants it to, was for it to be something large shares of reality didn't want to destroy. She understood a thing Keltham said on her first day here as a claim that this wasn't true, that he didn't think he was extending Golarion's lifespan in expectation. But, with caution about the mind states that permit her to help him without being a threat to Pharasma, she does, actually, strongly value the destruction of hell for that reason and thinks some substantial risk of destroying the world would be warranted, though by her own preference you'd spend decades exploring other hell conquest options first.
It's not a consolation he feels honesty safe and epistemically safe about offering her. That hell has been allowed to persist this long within creation, on those hypotheses where all of this is as real as themselves, and not quantitatively much less real than that, is evidence, within those hypotheses, that intervening in creation is expensive, and only became some combination of affordable plus attractive after the death of Eridan lost other hopes, or the shattering of prophecy made it less expensive to act against gods. It is possible that if this intervention against Pharasma fails, no other will be sent. Decades seems like quite an unreasonable amount of time for smart people to think. He'd take that time only if there was sufficient value of info, and he didn't expect to slip up, tip off the gods, and get squished inside of that delay. It does seem clear enough to him what he is sent here to do. He's not happy about it. He's a lot less happy about hell.
Carissa is largely resigned to the fact he is going to try it. She wants to convince him that only hell is worth doing it for, and that if he gets hell but Pharasma is unable or unwilling to change any other things about creation, then that should be sufficient for him not to prefer the world destroyed. She hopes to narrow the specification further, figure out the actual minimum ask, and make sure it's a concession Pharasma can grant if she wants to. She sees that Keltham isn't going to be willing to not try to destroy the universe. She hates him for this, on some level, but she doesn't predict anything different.
He is, in fact, presently minded to demand of Pharasma that protections be set up to make sure this doesn't happen again. Among the reasons why he would hesitate to simply press a button and destroy only Hell and Asmodeus, if he could come up with a scheme that he was sufficiently convinced would do that on a first try, is that Pharasma might just build a new Hell and then take Zon Kuthin out of the vault and put him in charge of Neo-Hell. The problem from his perspective is not just creation as it stands being horrible, but that creation has no rails against becoming even more horrible in the future if he solves the present horribleness. It may not be a way that people in Golarion are accustomed to thinking, who have so many problems today that need to be solved right now, but Dathilani try to put systems into states where they will knowably not go bad later, instead of just being okay right now. If creation isn't knowably on a trajectory that takes it permanently out of being a miserable hellhole, it unfortunately seems to him that his utility function strongly suggests smashing the whole place and letting sentient beings exist elsewhere instead, and the present inhabitants likewise having futures that continue mainly elsewhere. He's not sure why, earlier. Carissa expected their continuations to be awful. His model of outer gods and entities is that the ones which don't care about people will mainly not use matter in a way that involves it being people. Even the makers of the magical continuum, which very likely don't care about people, aren't taking all of the matter and reality fluid in the magical continuum and turning it into unhappy people. Past Keltham, possibly, got sent to Golarion because it was a particular kind of intervention that was cheaper to buy from the makers than anything more sensible. He was not put someplace that would hurt him as much as possible. He doesn't think that entities with simulating eyes on Pharasma's creation, or who trade with the makers of the magical continuum for information from it, that care about the sentience within it at all, would be trying to continue the people there past the end of Pharasma's creation with a goal of hurting them. The ones who care about continuations at all, he would hope, are themselves nice, or trading with entities that are, in the sum of their goals and auction bids, nice. If that's not so, he's substantially more peeved with whatever hypothetical entities sent him here to destroy creation, and also it seems less probable that caring entities would want that of him in the first place. That he is sent here, who will deliver an ultimatum to Pharasma to improve living conditions or be destroyed, is some evidence that he wouldn't have been sent here if the expected result of destroying creation were to isekai everyone here to worse than hell. Though, of course, the entities that sent him here could be acting deceptive about that, expecting himself or Pharasma to be deceived by the apparent evidence of their actions.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.